U.S. refugee resettlement program welcomes only the truly most vulnerable. But any immigrant journey has the potential to be traumatic. Leaving home, leaving everything you know, leaving family behind, etc., can forever change someone both physically and mentally. ChildSavers has a very long history in Richmond. I learned this morning from their website, it's the only nonprofit in Virginia using a coordinated prevention and intervention model to prepare children for lifelong learning, address mental health, and recover from trauma. They're present in our community, in schools, organizations, businesses, and reaching out to community leaders. And we're joined this morning by their Director of Health and Lead Trauma and Resilience Educator, John Richardson Lauve, LCSW. So I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself and tell us more about him and ChildSavers as he wishes.
Thanks so much, Sharon and Kate. Thanks for having me to get to today. It's great to be with you. As Sharon said, I'm the Director of Mental Health and Lead Trauma and Resilience Educator at ChildSavers. We've made it part of our mission as an organization to be trauma informed and to do that in an intentional way for all children. We're very blessed to be able to have impact all across the state of Virginia, nationally, and since COVID-19, and moving a lot of our training and resources online, had a lot of international impact as well, which is exciting to be able to do that, to be able to serve and support. I'm not going to do too much in terms of introduction because we only have an hour together today. And I'm kind of taking what would normally be a 3 or 4 hour workshop, and we're going to kind of smash it into an hour that we'll spend together. Get my screen together here. There we go. As we go through this hour, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, you can definitely share those. You can raise your hand and I'll see that on the participants tab. You can also just unmute yourself and that will kind of raise you to the top of the participants tab for me and I'll be able to see that. You can just interrupt. You can also put things in the chat. I have that on my screen that I'll try to be vigilant with as well. So that's my contact information on the screen and that link at the bottom there. And Sharon and Kate are welcome to provide that to folks in other ways if you have a mailing list for this. That link there, childsavers.link/IRC, will get you to a Google Drive folder. And in that Google Drive folder, you'll be able to find a PDF of this entire presentation. You'll also find a lot of other resources, including a 5 or 6 page resource document that will give you all sorts of different ways to look at and understand trauma-informed care, because we're only going to be able to unpack it so much today, but not thoroughly. So that will give you some resources for your continued and ongoing learning if you want to learn more about the topics that we're going to talk about today. So childsavers.link/IRC. So we are going to do some live polling, which is I find to be fun and exciting and engaging for audiences today. So you can either engage with this live polling either on your cell phone by using your text messaging or through a browser window on your computer or phone or tablet. But if you are texting, you text the word ChildSavers, all one word, to 22333. So that number is the destination, like a phone number that you're texting to, and text the word ChildSavers. Now, autocorrect oftentimes will put a space between child and savers because it's not typically a word that's smashed all together. If you do that and it autocorrects and puts a space there, you'll end up in someone else's poll, not in mine, which won't let you participate. So be aware of that, keep it all together, or you can go to pollev.com/ChildSavers, or you can use your phone and scan the QR code that's on the screen. Those instructions will be on the top of every live polling slide that we'll use. So if you need to get them again, they'll be on every live polling slide. So hopefully people are able to figure that out. And I don't see any questions about that. I'll leave that up there for one more minute while I give a little bit more introduction on myself and ChildSavers as an organization. We are founded in 1924, so we're coming up on our 100th year of serving the Richmond community. And Our work at ChildSavers started, ironically enough, in response to the flu pandemic that happened 100 years ago in 1917, 1918. And we were founded in response to that to serve children and families, and have been doing that for almost 100 years. The trauma-informed curriculum that you're going to go through today is something that we've been training in one form or another for over 5 years. And like I said, we've been able to present this all around the state of Virginia. We've worked with, I believe, 74 of the 132 school districts in the state of Virginia. Have worked with the FBI, did a long-term project in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm doing a project right now with Cornell University up in New York State. So exciting stuff. And if you want to learn more, you can feel free to contact me. So, what is one new hobby? Looks like people have been doing it already because you logged in. What is one new hobby that you've picked up during COVID? You can text in your answer or type it in if you're on a browser window. What is one new hobby that you picked up during COVID? This is just kind of a test slide. The bigger the word, the more it's been submitted. You are not slouches. You're great. If you do type into this word cloud a multiple word phrase, like if you want to say playing games, you need to either smash it all together, put an underscore or a hyphen, because otherwise playing and games will be submitted as separate words. Just a technicality there. I see baking, a lot of baking, cooking. Somebody's playing guitar, woodworking, yoga. Excellent. So just a little test slide there. Now I have a question for you. How much exposure have you had to concepts of trauma-informed care? A, B, C, D, or E? Just text in your answer. This lets me know kind of who's in the room, what we need to dive into, and how basic we need to be. Okay. Give folks another moment to respond. Good. So we have 7 people who've had a lot of exposure. Hopefully this won't be an unnecessary review for you today. We want to make it a big tent for everybody to be able to participate. So I really like this quote. I found this quote this week last week as I was preparing for this. And I wanted to tie in the concept of being a refugee to these concepts that we're going to talk about today of trauma-informed care. It says refugees didn't just escape a place. They had to escape 1,000 memories until they put enough time and distance between them and their misery to wake to a better day. These concepts of trauma-informed care, Bessel van der Kolk does a great job of talking about how trauma is not just the event. Trauma is not the event of being assaulted or attacked or abuse or whatever that might be. What the real trauma is, and what unfortunately really impacts people, is the echoes of those traumas. It's not just that event, but it's how it echoes within our bodies, within our souls, that lives within us. And we unfortunately have a hard time distancing ourselves with, because it's part of our story. And what I've experienced, what has been part of my story, is always going to be a part of my story. We can't ever erase that. What we can is put time and distance. We can work on healing. We can work on growth. We can work on support. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'd invite you to respond to this word cloud just with concepts of what does trauma look like? When you think of the word trauma, what does it look like? Maladaptive, I like that. Bruises, stunted, anxiety, fear, and stress. Anxiety, that's getting bigger there. Anger, disturbing behaviors. Stress, yeah. Sadness, bruise, those physical injuries that we might have. Fear. So sometimes I phrase this question in a different way, and I say, what word comes to mind when you think of trauma? And I've asked that question hundreds of times. And my favorite answer that I ever got, I was down in Raleigh, North Carolina, presenting this material to regional YMCA staff, and someone submitted the answer, and it said, "Not the end." So it's a really important, hopeful thing that we need to think about and need to hold in our hearts when we think about trauma, is that it isn't the end. It doesn't create a destiny or a locked-in trajectory. We have a lot of opportunities to heal and grow, but we need to have enough competence and vision and intentionality in order to support people with that. So thank you for submitting those. So when we define trauma, we think of trauma as being these 3 E's. Trauma is first and foremost an event. It is something that happens to an individual, but it is not just that event. And that's really important to remember, that if you find out that someone had an event that you think might be traumatic, it is fine to anticipate that, to set up a good support system, but it is not enough to assume, or it's not legitimate to assume that that event is a trauma for an individual, because different people experience the same event in very different ways. And that's really vital to understanding this concept of trauma-informed care. And so if, let's see, who do I see on my screen here? Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. Stephanie Gregory. So Stephanie and I are walking through the woods on a path, on a trail through the woods, and a snake comes across our path in the woods. Stephanie and I are experiencing the same event, right? But we might experience that event in very different ways. Stephanie might look at that snake and say, "Oh, I'm going to take a gentle step back. I'm going to let that snake do what it needs to do." And when the snake has gone along on the path, and then Stephanie's going to continue on her walk. And I might look at that snake and say, "Whoa, never being here again." I might hightail it out of the woods back into my house or my car and decide never to go walking in the woods, because the woods are a dangerous, scary place. So Stephanie and I can have the same event happen to us and experience it in very different ways. And what's really important to understand there is that trauma is in the eye of the beholder. It's not about how safe other people think snakes are. It's about how safe Stephanie feels in that moment. And it's about how safe I feel in that moment. That means that in order to understand someone's trauma, we have to understand how they experienced it, which means being trauma informed is being willing to engage in relationships, to understand people's stories. If for it to be trauma, that person experienced that event as being life-threatening, threatening to their safety, threatening to their well-being. It's overwhelming. It overwhelms my ability to cope. That I looked at that snake and I said, "That's overwhelming. I need to get away from it. It's dangerous. It's life-threatening, threatening to my safety." So that's really important. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder, which means we have to understand people's stories. And you can hear about the event, something awful that happened to an individual. And again, we can make good assumptions, or at least lean into the fact that this was probably a big trauma for that person. And sometimes it's not, or not perceived as such, maybe because they just had a whole lot of great coping skills and they're able to bounce back from that a lot easier than other people. But sometimes it might be because it's been normalized, or they're numb to it and they don't experience that trigger in the same way as other people, because they haven't known anything but, or they've experienced it for such a long time that they don't get aroused by that. That doesn't mean that it's less impactful in their life than for the person who does get significantly triggered. And that's really important. Just because someone's numb to the experience and it's been normalized for them, it doesn't mean that it's not triggering in the same ways and impactful in terms of their potential lifelong health in the same ways. So trauma is an event that's experienced as being overwhelming and life-threatening, and then it has adverse effects. It impacts my ability to function and cope in the world. It impacts my ability to function in my home life, in my family life, in my work life, school life, job life, health, all these ways that it impacts people. When we think about trauma, we usually think about it just as the event, right? We hear a story that someone's been assaulted and we think of that as being trauma. What we get to see oftentimes is the effects of trauma. All those words that you put up before, the sadness, the anxiety, the despair, the anger, the acting out, things like that. Those are the behaviors that we get to see. If we're trauma informed, we have to focus not on the first E and not on the third E. We have to focus on that middle E, how a person experienced it. Because if we understand that, then we can create effective interventions. We can create effective ways to respond to someone and help them heal and grow. So trauma is inherently a threat to safety. That I looked at that snake and I felt unsafe. But that safety can create other losses as well. And think about the people that you work with. Think about the individuals that you serve, that you help to heal, to feel safe. That loss, that safety loss, can create also a loss of maybe power and control. Or maybe a loss of boundaries because someone violated my boundaries and didn't help keep me safe. And therefore, because I lost that sense of boundaries, I'm going to try to establish and over-assert my boundaries, over-assert based on what most people do, because I need to feel that safety. Or if I need to over-assert my power and control, I might reassert that in ways that aren't really healthy. Someone put the word up in that word cloud, maladaptive, before. That trying to get some power and control might have been really functional back years ago in my past. But now it's not so functional. Now it's not adaptive. It's not helping me to function and grow. But the fact is that I have this internal hunger for power in a maladaptive way because power was taken from me. And everyone needs to feel some power and control in their life. Or maybe it's for attachment and consistency and connection. And if I yearn for that because I had that taken from me, whether it's my partner, my spouse, my child, my loved one, and that attention or attachment and connection, the relationship, the consistency of being in relationship and feeling safe with someone else was taken from me, that might lead me to having maladaptive behaviors in relationships. I might be too clingy, or I might be way standoffish, and I might not want anything to do with other people because I withdraw and I isolate because I don't feel safe when I'm connected, when I'm engaged with other people. So these touch points on the screen, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but these touch points, these losses, are what people hunger for and want to get back, unfortunately, in maladaptive ways. And these are how we can help to help people to heal and grow, because when an individual has that loss of safety, that loss of trust and protection and attachment, we're going to help them, support them in different ways than if their need is for power and control, which we're going to support them in different ways than if their need is for boundaries. I'll tell you a brief story. As a clinical therapist, I worked with a young man years ago in therapy. He had been in foster care for many years. I started working with him about the age of 12. Earlier in his life, he had been in an abusive household where horrible, horrible things had happened to him. Awful, awful abuse. He was taken out of that home around the age of 7. And he was put into, as many kids in the foster care system, he bounced from foster home to foster home to foster home. But then at the age of 12, he came into a family where they said, we want to be your forever family. We want to adopt you. And objectively, that's a great thing. I worked with him and the family for the next 4 years. Apparently, I'm not a very good therapist, because over the course of those 4 years, the two things he continued to tell me consistently over the course of 4 years was, I can't trust anyone. There's no one in the world that I trust to keep me safe. And the second thing he said about his adoptive parents was, I know they'll hit me eventually. Because in his mind, what had been queued up in his neural networks, we can talk about mirror neurons, we'll talk about a little bit about brain science in a bit, but what had been queued up in his brain was people who say they love me and say they're going to keep me safe are also people who hurt me. And people who don't keep me safe, people who hit me, and people who leave me. And that had been queued up in his brain and tied together. So that is to say, what he needed was not what his adoptive parents intuitively wanted to give him. They wanted to say, we love you, we're your forever family, you're safe here. But the more they did that, the less safe he felt. The less safe he felt. And the result of that, what we really need to keep in mind when we're working with people who've experienced trauma, is we need to help them feel safe in their own skin, not in mine. And that means what they need is not necessarily intuitively what I would give them, that I need to be able to support them in the ways that they need to be supported. Let me skip forward in my slide deck here. Oops. Pardon me. There we go. So if we're going to be trauma informed in what we do, we need to make sure that we respond to the need that people have rather than just reacting to behavior. That if I look at those behaviors that you put up before, the anxiety, the stress, the anger, and I just look at that behavior and I say, well, we need to have consequences because you're getting too angry and you're hitting people, that's not going to help, because if that need behind that behavior is for power and control or for boundaries and safety, then we can help support that individual by responding to the need that's behind that behavior. I do a lot of workshops in schools, as I mentioned before. Oftentimes I ask questions when I'm doing workshops in a live environment with school staff, and I'll ask, how many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school? And I get almost all the hands raised, because if you've been teaching long enough, you know kids who've been suspended from school. And then I'll ask another question. I'll ask, how many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school and came back from that suspension with better behavior? And then almost all the hands go down. We have these responses or these reactions to behavior that don't respond to the need that's behind behavior. So again, in order to be that behavior detective, we have to look at what is lost because of that experience of trauma. That loss of safety, power and control, attention, boundaries, all those sorts of things, those are where we can respond to the need. We can look at that need, find that need, examine that need, and respond appropriately. And then we have to ask this question, what happened to you? If we're going to be trauma informed, if we're going to look through a good trauma informed lens, what happened to you? Instead of asking the question, what's wrong with you? When we ask this question, what happened to you? What we're doing is, as I mentioned before, we're willing to engage in relationship. We are willing to connect with an individual. We're willing to hear their story. What happened to you? Very different question than what's wrong with you. Now, of course, sometimes people aren't going to answer this question. And maybe it's because they don't want to tell you about the big bad things that have happened to them. I've told my story enough. I am happy to tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I don't want to tell you about that awful thing that happened to me back when I was 12 years old. Don't need to tell that story. Doesn't mean that it's not there. Doesn't mean that it doesn't influence them every day of their life. But they might not want to tell that story. They might not want to tell that story, or might not be able to tell that story, maybe because they don't even know the story. Maybe because that traumatic event happened at such an early age that it didn't imprint as a conscious memory. Or maybe, like I said before, it was just normalized that doesn't everybody experience life like this? This wasn't out of the ordinary in my worldview, that this is everybody's world. The most important place to ask this question, this what happened to you question, is inside our own heads. That when you're working with somebody who has a specific reaction of anger or sadness or disconnection, that it might very well be because of the answer to this question, the what happened to you. And we can't pathologize or demonize or get angry with behavior, because there is always that what happened to you story. This is another quote that I really like, James Baldwin quote, and it really talks well about trauma. He says, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry our history with us. We are all unconsciously controlled by our history in so many ways, and our history is literally present in all that we do. That young man that I talked about before, who was in that adoptive home and I worked with for 4 years, what his adoptive parents wanted to do passionately, what they wanted to do was hit the reset button. They wanted to say, that's all in your past. Let's leave that in your past. Take a fresh start. Make a fresh start. Hit the reset button. And that is not reality, because we are all the sum of our stories. That awful thing that happened to me at the age of 12 is going to live with me forever in the fabric of my being. What we get to decide is whether I get to heal and grow from that and move on, and it's a part of my story, but not an overwhelming something that defines me. Real quick here, some signs and symptoms of trauma: avoidance of trauma-related thoughts and feelings, intrusive memories. You know all these, exaggerated startle response. What's going on here is a body gets geared up to look for threats all the time, to look for threats and to be able to stay safe. That avoidance of trauma-related thoughts and feelings, my hippocampus in my brain, which converts experience into memory, my hippocampus changes gears when I experience a traumatic event. And it makes me, it actually broadens how I remember the traumatic event. My hippocampus, if I get T-boned as I go through an intersection, I don't know if you know this person. I know people who will drive 10 blocks out of their way to avoid that intersection, because what their memory remembers is that intersection is a bad place where bad things happen. What their memory should have remembered is pickup trucks that run red lights are bad. That's an accurate memory. But our hippocampus is not geared up for accuracy. Our hippocampus is geared up for safety. And so it's willing to overgeneralize. It's willing to broaden and generalize to things that are not inherently threats, because that's what's going to keep me safe. One of the things that in my professional history, my wife and I worked with for 8 years with kids in the foster care system. For 6 of those years, we lived with 8 teenage girls in foster care in our home. So we had over 50 kids in foster care come through our home. Now, those 8 teenage girls that we lived with, while we lived with them, unfortunately, the vast majority of those girls had had bad things happen to them, traumatic events, and most frequently those traumatic events had happened at the hands of a man, of an adult man. And I, as an adult man, an authority figure and caregiver who was in their home, I was a trauma trigger for almost all of these girls, because their hippocampus had been programmed in not to say Uncle Steve is bad, because Uncle Steve did bad things to me in my history. What they had geared up in their head was men are bad, which overgeneralized and created this, what some might think an irrational trauma trigger or a maladaptive trauma trigger, because that trauma trigger was geared towards keeping me safe, keeping them safe. Those intrusive memories, thoughts, nightmares, that's the brain trying to reprocess, oftentimes ineffectively, that brain trying to reprocess and reintegrate those concepts. Hyperactivity, irritability, and aggressive behavior, that's acting out. Withdrawal and social isolation, that's acting in. So let me switch forward to my slide deck here. There we go. So we're not going to get into the adverse childhood experiences study. What I want to do is help you have a broad concept of what trauma is. And it's really anything that causes chronic toxic stress. If you're not familiar with the adverse childhood experiences study, I definitely encourage you to look into it, to read more about it. Search it on YouTube. You can find all sorts of great resources for it. It's the science, the research that gave us data that was the foundational research that connects childhood trauma to lifetime health outcomes. That if I have a higher load of childhood trauma, I am more likely in my adulthood to have liver disease, heart disease, lung disease, tuberculosis, cancer, Alzheimer's and dementia in my old age, unintended pregnancies, early initiation of smoking, substance abuse and alcohol use, all sorts of things. As loads of childhood trauma go up, the likelihood of negative health outcomes goes up. But it's not just adverse childhood experiences, because many of the people that you work with might be adults and have experienced awful things in adulthood too. So there are multiple diversity or multiple domains of what we call adversity here that I have up on the screen. We have not only adverse childhood experiences, we have adverse catastrophic events like a global pandemic, like forest fires, things that are shared that are catastrophes. Any kind of natural disaster could fall in this adverse catastrophic events bucket. We have adverse circuitry expressions, which are how a brain gets wired up, whether it's cerebral palsy, whether it's autism spectrum disorder, things like that. And that's not to say that those events or those brain wiring are inherently themselves a trauma, but in our world, in our society, oftentimes those brains that get wired up have more of a propensity to experience trauma because of the way that the world treats them. We have adverse community environments, which create experiences where we have housing problems, poverty, communities that are food deserts, things like that, where those community environments are adverse. And then we have adverse cultural exposures, things like homophobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, things like that, where culture treats us differently. What this is a big, broad bucket of anything that is chronic toxic stress. Okay, chronic toxic stress. Anything that causes stress at a large amount on an ongoing basis. And that's overwhelming. And that's what creates all the problems that we need to deal with. So I'm going to talk about this, the I'll go back to that slide. So we used to think of triune brain. I'm not going to share too much about that. But now the more modern thinking is called the predicting brain processing theory. And this comes from the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's there. Her name's on the bottom of that slide. She has a wonderful book called How Emotions Are Made that I highly recommend. It's a very, unfortunately, thick, dense book, but it's great. She also has a more recent book called 7.5 Things. What's it called? I have it right down there. 7.5 Things About the Brain, something like that. But very good, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And this predictive processing brain model says that we're not reacting when we engage in behavior, but what we're doing is we're predicting. So up there at the top, we have sensory input. So that's me being a man in the home with the girls in foster care that I worked with. So they are exposed to proximity of a man being with them. And they look into their statistical predictions, which means they look into their history. They look into their history, and in their history, it says men are dangerous. I've coded that in. My hippocampus, my brain has said men are dangerous. And that creates this unbalanced interoception. Interoception is my sensory experience of my body. It's kind of a fancy word. It's all those internal things that happen when we're stressed, scared, anxious. Those internal body experiences, if I'm unbalanced because I am predicting threat, that means that my stomach is in knots, my heart starts going faster, I start getting that anxiety, that fear. That results in that fight, flight, or freeze, that stress response that makes me want to stay alive, what keeps us alive. That results in an energy drain, and then that reinforces this prediction error that when I'm around this man, and then I felt all these feelings inside, and that didn't feel good. I went into survival mode, and the result of that is this fatigue and energy drain. Then that reinforces the fact that when I'm around men, I'm not safe. So that reinforces this cycle of predicting threat. If I'm around a man, I predict threat. What we want to do is predict safety. So for many people in the world, when they have that sensory input about being around an adult male, if they haven't had this history, then their statistical prediction, they're going to look at their history and say being around an adult man is not something that's a threat. So they can predict safety instead of predicting threat. And if they pivot and predict safety, they're going to have balance on the inside. They're going to be able to lean into connection and engagement, things like that. That's going to replenish energy because we're hardwired for that. And it's going to reinforce the fact that being around men is a safe thing. So the bottom line here is that the people that you're working with have a long history. And again, we don't get to hit the reset button. We have to look at that history. And what we have to do is create a new history. That today I want them to feel safe so that tomorrow they can look back at their history and have one more day of safety in it than they did threat. So we have these networks in our brains, and when we wire up these networks, we have to first ask this fundamental question, am I safe? And when I ask this question, am I safe, and I can't answer it with a yes. When I answer it with a no, I can't do anything else because safety is a fundamental need. So when I can't feel safe, when I don't feel safe, and that might be because of a real true threat that's around me, but it might also be because of my lived experience, because of my history, because my history makes me today predict threat and a lack of safety, I'm going to go into those survival modes, fight, flight, freeze, things like that. And unfortunately, it's hard to get beyond that. So we have to ask this fundamental question, am I safe? And help the people around us and the people that we're serving to feel safe as much as we can. And sometimes we can't do that effectively. Sometimes we have a hard time leaning into that because it's something on the inside. It's, again, that history. But that fundamental need, am I safe? Once they answer the question, yes, answer yes to that question, am I safe? Then they have to ask a question, am I connected? Am I connected? And if they don't feel connected, then they're going to engage in behavior that's going to seek that connection seeking, what sometimes we call attention seeking behaviors. They're going to try to engage in that in a healthy or unhealthy way, but they're going to try to get those connections because, again, we are hardwired for those connections. And that might look maladaptive, like sabotaging relationships or withdrawal, which isn't a way to connect, but it's stemming from this need to connect regardless. So you can't do anything with a person. You can't help lead them to live their best life until they can feel safe and feel connected. And only then can we go into what we talk about as these learning networks. And learning networks are going to help me if I feel safe and if I feel connected, then I can do all those things that we all want to be able to do on a daily basis. The learning, the problem solving, the organizing, the self-regulation, things like that. And that comes from feeling safe and feeling connected. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Let's pivot. If we can help people to feel safe and connected, then we want to build on resilience. What does resilience look like to you? Remember, if it's a multiple word phrase, either smash it together, put a hyphen or an underscore. Endurance, I like that. What does resilience look like? Hopeful? Taking deep breaths, strength? Scaling mountains? Nice. Wholeness, I like that. Feeling safe. Good, thank you for sharing. Strength. So strength is a good word. Let's hone in on that for a moment. In order to get strong, if I go to the gym or go outside and run, then I'm going to do work to make myself stronger. Maybe I want to be a faster runner, so I'll crank up the treadmill a little bit, or I'll try to run further or faster. And that's going to break my body down a little bit, but my body will heal and then hopefully grow strong. If I go into the gym and lift weights, what I'm trying to do is lift weights today so that tomorrow I can lift something a little heavier. And that's that strength. So the people that you work with and serve have a great opportunity to build strength, because unfortunately, in order to be strong, we have to be challenged. We have to be challenged, and coming through that struggle to the other side can give us the opportunity to feel that strength, to build that strength. What we have to make sure that we do is not experience that struggle in an overwhelming way, because it's hard to grow, to heal from that if we experience that struggle in an overwhelming way. So that's what we have the opportunity to do. You and I, in our insight, because we are kind, caring individuals, you don't have to have letters after your name. You don't have to have a college degree to help with this healing. This healing comes from the experience of being in relationship. Again, feeling connected and feeling safe. So I want to introduce you to a resilience model that I really like, and these 5 building blocks of resilience. These building blocks of resilience are fundamental for caring for others, and they're also fundamental in caring for ourselves. So the self-care piece of this is no different. Building out this model of resilience for other people is no different than what I would do for myself. That connection network is fundamental here. We have to help people feel safe, but then we have to help people with that connection network, which is about attachments and relationships. Attachments and relationships are fundamental, are integral to helping people to be resilient. We need to help them not feel alone in the world. Research shows that people who don't have at least one meaningful, deep connection in their life are much more prone to not only health issues, but also behavioral issues. Think about how often when we have big bad things that happen in our world, or if you are working with people and they make really poor decisions, think about how often those individuals are people who had no meaningful, kind, caring relationships and attachments in their lives. So that is fundamental, and that is the cornerstone to building resilience, is having kind, healthy attachments. Research also shows that if individuals who have five meaningful relationships in their lives, that those people who have at least 5 are much less likely to experience both negative health outcomes as well as negative behavioral outcomes. That 5 is your golden number. And of course, all of our relationships don't have to be those unwavering champions in our lives, those deep, meaningful, but we need those, and we need the casual ones too. Second there is regulation. We need to be able to regulate our own selves and our bodies, and we need to be able to regulate our minds as well. That mental Regulation might be about mindfulness and yoga and deep breaths for some people, but that's not all of it. Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her book that I referenced before, uses the phrase oftentimes, variation is the norm. So that yoga and mindfulness might be right for some people because that's down regulating, but some people need to upregulate. Some people, in order to relax, they need to go out and go for that run or lift heavy things or dance. That's a regulatory behavior, but it's upregulating rather than down regulating. We need to be able to regulate our mind and regulate our bodies. Think about how oftentimes you or the people that you serve and work with find healing in movement, in going for a walk, in being in nature. There's a whole science called forest bathing, like being in the woods and taking a bath, but not. It's bathing yourself in the forest. And this research that comes out of primarily Japan talks about measuring stress indicators before and after taking a 30-minute walk in the woods versus spending those 30 minutes sitting and meditating versus spending those 30 minutes in a city environment. And that forest nature experience can be very healing and redemptive for an individual. So we need to be able to help people regulate and be tuned into how they need to regulate. What's right for them, not what's right for me or what am I projecting on them. Competence. This is about self-esteem. I need to feel good about what I do. I need to feel like I have impact. I need to feel like I'm doing something worthwhile. Think about COVID-19. Think about back in April and May, March, April, May, when we all were restricted in terms of our movement. Think about all the competence, all the people who leaned into that need for competence and impact. Think about how yeast and bread flour was not available in the stores. Think about all the people who started home improvement projects or crafting projects, all the hobbies that were started. And those experiences, those hobbies that people started or skills that people tried to learn, those are leaning into this need for competence. The gardening, the baking, all these things are not just because I have extra time. It's because I want to do something good. I'm going to learn guitar so I can feel like I'm having impact in the world, so I can feel like I'm competent at something, and that boosts my self-esteem. Because when we boost that self-esteem, I do these workshops oftentimes, and every once in a while somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, "Hey, John, thanks a lot. I appreciate you. I learned a lot today." And what that does is it boosts my competence, sense of competence and self-esteem. And that helps me to overcome the bad things that have happened in my life, because it helps me be a more resilient individual. Helps me overcome, unfortunately, the struggle and the trauma that I might experience today, and helps me to look forward into the future and be a stronger, more resilient person, just because someone gave me that compliment. So we need to build these resilience pieces in the people that we work with and do them in very intentional ways. Think about over the course of a day or a week, you can look at these 5 building blocks of resilience and think, what did I do today to really lean into attachment? Or what am I doing to help this person that I'm serving and working with and supporting to lean into attachment, to regulate their body and mind, to feel competent? The last 2 are about gratitude and hope. If gratitude's for today, hope is for tomorrow. Gratitude, there's a whole science of positive psychology about gratitude. People keep gratitude journals. Think about how many faith practices focus on gratitude, whether it's sitting and saying our prayers before a meal, in a worship service, things like that. Think about how fundamental gratitude is in those practices. And that's because gratitude helps the soul. Gratitude helps me when I express gratitude towards someone else, and gratitude helps the receiver as well to feel good about what they're doing, and it builds connection and it exhibits that reciprocity. We need to be able to be grateful for things, and not in a it could be worse kind of way. We need to be sincerely grateful for the things that we do. I challenge you to sit down today and write out a list of 5 or 10 things that you're truly sincerely grateful for. And to just embody that, to sit with that for a minute, and to see how you feel afterwards. Again, if gratitude's for today, hope is for tomorrow. So hope is looking into the future, because sometimes today is kind of a struggle. So I can look forward into the future. I can take a rope, make it into a lasso, and throw it forward into the future and pull myself up forward into the future. We need to be meaningfully and manifest that hope for ourselves and look into the future and be hopeful. Think about those of you who are parents. Think about whether your kids manifest that gratitude and what they're thankful for today, but also looking into the future. What are they hopeful for? What are they looking forward to? Because that helps us be resilient. Again, these 5 elements are things that we can do meaningful in our daily lives for other people and manifest them for ourselves too. These are not rocket science at all, but we have to do these in intentional ways. And when we do these in intentional, meaningful ways, we can help people to be resilient, help people to overcome the trauma of their past, their struggles today, and help people to be stronger for tomorrow. Because I don't have to know about any of your, the 28 of you, I don't have to know about any of you and your experiences of trauma in your life to know that every one of you, myself included, every one of us can benefit from being more resilient. So that is to say, everyone has experienced struggles in their lives. Some of those have something we could call trauma and maybe not. I don't have to know about that history to know that we need to lean into that resilience. We need to manifest that, to build that resilience in ourselves and in other people as well. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to take a sip of water and see if anybody has any questions. If you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand, you can do that in the responses tab, I think it is, or you can put it in the chat. If anyone has any thoughts that they want to share, stories that they want to share, insights that you have, or questions that you have for me. Kate asked, do you have any practical ideas for how we can intentionally engage in these things virtually? So I did, back in April, May, June, took this resilience model and really built it out in workshops. And I think I called them something about resilience in the times of COVID-19. So definitely, we can take all 5 of these and really look at manifesting them in our current world. So yes, attachment, definitely we have a lot of lack of opportunity that Kate, you and I can't go out for drinks this evening or have a lunch meeting or something like that. But we do have the opportunity to all get together like we are now. So we can lean into what's strong rather than what's wrong. And I can have a meeting with my boss who's across town just as easily as I can have a meetup with my grandmother who lives in California. So we can lean into that and do those in meaningful ways, and work on connecting with people and making that real. So that's an example with attachments. With regulation, yes, regulation can be a really hard thing for me because my kitchen and bags of potato chips and last night's pizza are like 12 feet from me in that direction. And it's a lot harder to stay regulated because I can't go to the gym, I can't go lift heavy things, I can't exercise in the same way. For us as adults, the fundamentals to regulation are about how am I eating, how am I sleeping, and how am I exercising. So we need to look at those and look at how do we regulate and what are we doing in meaningful ways when we are living in this virtual space. How do I do that? I got myself a standing desk. You can see I'm kind of moving around here because I can't sit down. This is how I regulate when throughout my workday, whether I'm training and presenting or just answering email and doing other things, that I stand up. I find ways to regulate. I take work breaks. I go outside. I get my fresh air, things like that. Again, competence through virtual world, we need to be able to have impact. So finding new ways to do that, to be able to feel like we're having that impact and we're not starved for that desire to feel impact, to feel competent, to be able to make those connections. So it's about the intentionality and really building that in fundamental ways. And if you're in a moment of needing self-care and to live into that, what we need to do is find ways to really operationalize that. I've taken this resilience model and built it out with school groups, with organizations, with companies, and after school programs, and really said, what are you doing? And what are you doing to be intentionally, again, that word, intentionally resilient and building it out? So Molly asks, you're welcome. Neuroplasticity, amazingly powerful. Several points about the power of supportive community, complementing. Have any tips on how to effectively support newcomers who've experienced trauma for volunteers? How for volunteers to help newcomers who've experienced trauma, and if you're meeting with them virtually. So yes. So I think virtually, doing that virtually. So I'll go back to neuroplasticity first. Neuroplasticity, for those of you who aren't aware, it's about the brain's ability to heal after bad things have happened, and not necessarily bad things. It's about the brain's ability to grow and to progress and move forward. So the neuroplasticity is a wonderful, wonderful thing. If we were talking about brains, I don't know, 40 years ago, we didn't know about this concept of neuroplasticity because the only brains we ever got to look at were dead brains. And now we get to look at brains through modern neural imaging, and we get to look at brains heal and grow. So yes, and the fundamental element of that is, again, is safety, is connections in order to get into that learning brain, and that's where we have the opportunity to do that healing and growth. So working to do that virtually, my clinicians have had to do this not with newcomers, but with in all of our mental health work that's had to pivot to telehealth. And I've been amazed at the things that they've done in order to engage their clients, their children and adolescents over virtual platforms. There's a lot of opportunity for that. So virtually, if you're on a Zoom meeting, you can definitely, you can share pictures. I've had people who've created Google Docs, no, not Google Docs, Google Slides. That's what they're using. They're using Google Slides to create virtual environments for people to be in. Definitely, they've spent time, and this is with children and adolescents, spent time doing fun things like creating, what do they call them, Bitmojis, and annotating and drawing on the screen together, things like that. But just really doing those interactions where we can connect with other people, because again, all we're doing is connecting, and we're having to do that over this virtual platform, most definitely. And technology definitely can be a barrier, as well as competence with the technology, that can be a real difficulty. So we have to find ways in a culturally competent way to be able to bridge that as much as we can, which means we might have to teach them about the technology if they don't have that, or might have to give them the technology. I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions about that that they would like to share. Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Any success stories in ways that you've been able to connect with people virtually? Definitely, that creativity can be a wonderful thing. Stephanie.
So I work with, my beneficiaries are high school students in Rwanda, and many of them don't have access to internet, or they have limited access to internet. So we've worked by sending bulk SMSs with just simple questions like, what types of activities are you doing for exercise? Are you doing any art, like during this lockdown period? And just asking them to engage by responding by text message, or those that have limited internet have WhatsApp. And we formed WhatsApp groups where they can actually send us a photo of what they're doing during the lockdown, or they can communicate with each other and stay in touch. So that's something that we've done to overcome that challenge, because Zoom and these online platforms like just aren't possible for many of our beneficiaries, but they really look forward to seeing each other's photos and staying connected, you know, in that way. But, you know, I would like your advice on this. How, you know, we choose topics around joy, creativity, activities, but we also know that many of them are encountering more domestic violence at home during this period, because Rwanda was in a total lockdown, where families weren't permitted to work, to leave the house. It's very different than what a lockdown in the United States is. If you leave your house, you'll be arrested, you'll be fined, you'll sleep in the stadium. So how do we reach out in more meaningful ways about some of these other challenges that our beneficiaries are likely facing, without focusing on the bad, because we have these very limited communications. Their text messages limited to 250 characters, and we know that there are other situations and other things that our beneficiaries might want to talk about, but it's very hard in that limited capacity to engage, I think, on a deeper level.
Yeah, great question. I really like your SMS engagement that you were talking about, and I like the fact, if I heard you correctly, or that you're asking specific questions, and you can really drill into that instead of saying, how are you today, but to ask a specific question like, what are you doing for your personal health today, or what are you doing for exercise today, or whatever that specific question is. And you could have the opportunity to gear those questions towards that resilience model, if you choose to ask those specific questions to get them brainstorming. What I've done after when I do have the opportunity to do ongoing workshops, I'm doing 5 months of professional development work with Cornell between January and May, and we're giving them self-care challenges between each workshop, and having them email or text in what they're doing to take care of themselves, what they're doing for self-care. And it's fun because people respond with pictures or with stories or what have you, and then that can kind of gamify that. So that doesn't address the safety question that you were getting to. I think being willing to ask specific questions about safety, and what are you doing to help yourself feel safe and stay safe right now, might be an opportunity there. But yeah, that is definitely a challenge, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's other things, interpersonal violence, the kids that are in the community who might be experiencing abuse or neglect, and it's not getting to the attention of the people who might be able to help them because everyone's confined. That's a real challenge. I don't know that I have any magic answer for that. Anyone else want to respond to that or share? Unfortunately, as you know, and I hate to say this, one of the things that we always have to realize is the limitations of what we can and can't do. And that if I'm trying to serve someone in Rwanda over text messages, there's not a whole lot that I can do. We have to lean into what we can. Again, focusing on what's strong, not what's wrong.
Well, and even beyond the pandemic, culturally, abuse is completely accepted, and it's considered like an appropriate way to parent, and so it's already a challenge, and we have to be very careful not to approach it too quickly because barriers will automatically come up. But just in this time especially, we're trying to create a safe space, even if it's only through SMS and it's only through phone. And if you think that it's good to be direct and ask some of these questions directly, similar to what we've done about health and well-being, but what are your personal experiences with violence in the home or challenges in the home? But from our perspective, there was some concern, is this too direct? Is it too much to ask these questions? But
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but even so, maybe for some beneficiaries, it will be too much, it will be too intense. But I think if it, from your suggestion, if it does open the doors even to some to see us as a safe space where they can reach out and they can share their experiences, then I think it's worth going forward and trying it, because we've been following this SMS model for 1 year now. We haven't been able to see our beneficiaries in person for 1 year, when typically we will have seen them 6 times face to face, in this last year. So it's certainly a challenge, but Yeah, again, I think we're just concerned about pushing too hard or pushing
Yeah.
boundaries like too quickly, but at the same time, it's like a year, and with the vaccine coming, we feel like there's an end in sight, but now there are still positive cases after the vaccine and the South African variant. So, we're just working harder now to adjust more quickly to with
Yeah.
the expectation that this is what the next year will look like. We can't just wait for the pandemic to end because the vaccines are coming.
Right. Well, Marilyn and Helen in the chat asked a question that connects with what you're getting at, which is that question of what happened to you. That it is important at times when appropriate to ask out loud, definitely. But there are also times when it's not appropriate to ask that question. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Good old clinician and therapist training, we were taught to always ask that question. We were taught to always, client would come into your office and you'd say, tell me your story. And they'd say, you got my chart, haven't you read my chart? And we'd say, I want to hear the story from you, which unfortunately is re-traumatizing for a person to have to tell that story again and again and again. So sometimes it's not appropriate to ask that question, because just asking that question might re-traumatize an individual in the first place. Definitely, if you don't have the capacity to deal with the story, that might be overwhelming for you. And that's what we call vicarious trauma, where we as the helper end up being a vessel for that story, and that can be traumatizing for us. So yes, the most important place to ask that what happened to you question is inside my own head, so that Stephanie, that when one of your people you're working with doesn't respond to your SMS for a week, then you know that there might be a story behind that. Might very well be a story behind that of what happened to them, that it's not that slight. What's wrong with them? Why can't they stick to the schedule or what have you? That there's a story there that we can invite them into if we choose. But to acknowledge and honor that story is the most important part of it. To know that there is a story there, but I don't have to know about someone's story. Because that's the event question, right? That first E, that how they experience that and how that's playing out in their behavior, in whether that's maladaptive or not. That's where the money is. So I don't have to know that story. I work with people all the time who say, I need to know the story. I want to know what happened. And that's not nearly as important as to what are their needs. Do they need extra power and control? Do they need to feel safe? Do they need boundaries? Do they need somebody who doesn't look like me to help them? Because maybe I am that trigger for them. And in order to feel safe, they need somebody who doesn't look like me, act like me. We are at the end of our time, and I want to respect people's time. If anyone has any additional questions, I'm happy to stay on for time and discuss those. I want to end with a real brief story that I feel like is inspiring. Brene Brown is an author and speaker and writer, and done a lot of great stuff. I know she's got a lot of fans in the community. Well, one of my favorite things that Brene Brown has written is called the Manifesto of the Brave and the Brokenhearted. And in the Manifesto of the Brave and the Brokenhearted, it's in that Google Drive folder, which actually I'll put up on the screen. There we go. Oops. Share my screen, apologies. There we go. There's that Google Drive link again at the bottom. So in that, I put a copy of the Manifesto of the Brave and the Brokenhearted by Brene Brown. It's just a one page, it's pretty brief. And in this, Brene says that oftentimes people want to be the hero of their own story, the story of their lives. They want to be the hero. They want to be the champion. They want to slay the dragon. And Brene says that is not what we should wish for people. She says that oftentimes people who've experienced a lot of trauma in their lives see themselves as a victim. And sometimes people even see themselves as the villain in the story of their lives. And that's, of course, not what we should wish for anybody. She says that what we should wish for people, for ourselves and the people that we care about, is to be authors. And when I'm the author of my life, the story of my life, I get to decide if that awful thing that happened to me at the age of 12 defines me. If I'm an author, I get to decide if that's the title of my book, or maybe it's just a chapter within my book, which has all sorts of other wonderful stories in it. Or maybe it's just a paragraph within a chapter. What I never get to do, and what you can never do for or help the people you serve, tear that part of their story out and ball it up and throw it away. Because the experiences that people have had will always be the experiences that they've had. We don't get to make those go away. We don't get to erase them out of their life experience. What we get to do is decide how it's written. And we get to decide, if we're authors, how those stories are written and how much they dominate our identity, whether they define us or whether they're just part of our story. And that means, going back to that predictive brain model theory, is that we have to have a lot of other stories to put in that book of our lives. And then we get to decide how it's written. And when we build in intentional ways resilience for people, when we support people with resilience, we get to help them be authors. We get to help them be authors. So that is what I have to share with you today in terms of helping support resilience in individuals, helping people to be trauma informed in the work that you do and the service that you provide in the community and in our world. And yeah, if there's any questions or people who want to share anything, share stories or insights or how you've seen this play out for you, I'm welcome or happy to hang out. Thank you for the work that you do and the services that you provide, the support that you give for people in need. That's definitely, we need more of that in the world.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for joining. Looks like most people are dropping off, but if you do want to stay for a minute, we can keep the room open. We don't have anything scheduled directly after this. And I appreciate Stephanie's suggestion of asking questions about the present, giving people a chance to respond about something they're experiencing now, because so many of the building blocks that we are used to, I think maybe just in our culture of where are you from, how did you get here, do you have additional family here or back home, can be so re-traumatizing, and giving people a chance to tell their story when they're comfortable, not when you feel you need to know, is really nice. Asking people those questions about the present, share a picture of what you're doing right now, share a picture of what you're doing, of something you made for lunch or something like that. I think that's really nice.
Yeah, it's really been surprising how quickly I think these students were able to kind of build a community online when it was something that, they just didn't. Culturally, everything happens face to face. Any important conversations happen face to face, and connections happen face to face. So seeing youth pick up this like limited technology and find creative ways to use it and share has been, really encouraging, and it's an escape from their home and their daily life. And I think that's a positive that's come from the pandemic and the lockdowns. And I'm excited to see how they move forward with it once life resumes to the new normal, whatever that will be.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Stephanie. All right. Sharon, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. It was very informative, and thank you for all the great resources that you shared. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Hope the rest of the event goes well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.